So I wanted to reflect a little bit on my reading at the beginning of Eckhart Tolle's A New Earth. And I'll start by just reading a few passages. Tolle writes, "As the consciousness of human beings developed, flowers were most likely the first thing they came to value that had no utilitarian purpose for them. That is to say, was not linked in some way to survival." So in other words, flowers were the first religious symbol for human beings, the first object which they distinguished in their environment that had ultimate significance for them, rather than merely accidental significance, as most other objects, most other natural objects. So Tolle goes on to say that the first recognition of beauty was one of the most significant events in the evolution of human consciousness. So as soon as we're able to become aware of the fact that we are aware, our basic awareness, our instincts being only that which feels, but which is completely swallowed by the surrounding environment and can only react rather than respond to its environment. But as soon as we become aware of beauty, we're actually reflecting on our environment. We're stepping out of nature and looking at it, observing it, becoming a spectator, and in another sense, a creator, an artist, because any form which is called art requires the participation of subject and object. An art form is a free creation of the human spirit, of the relationship between subject and object. I and you, or I and it, depending on the particular form of art you're talking about. The kind of art that we call drama, or in another sense, our actual personal lives, is a participatory art. The art which we think of as being the production of some artifact, some object, some painting, some movie, some sculpture, some piece of literature. That requires more of the role of a spectator, but also a certain degree of participation, because you need to understand the articulation of the artist. You need to be able to use the artifact which has been created for you before it is art for you, before it alters your experience and your consciousness. So I really like what Tolle is aiming at in this book, which is to talk about that which transcends the ego, and how we should not identify with merely the ego when there is all of the rest of our experience. At the same time, I don't know that the ego is necessarily a dysfunction, which is what Tolle calls it. He says the ego is the blueprint for dysfunction that every human being carries within. And I think this is certainly true in many cases, but it's not a necessary truth. It's you need an ego before you can transcend an ego. You need to be able to operate in the world of personality, of persons, of egos, and of course the ego is a mask. It's not your true identity, but until you have acquired it and understood it and become familiar with it such that you can operate at that level in a skillful way, then you're never going to be able to move on to the transpersonal, to the spiritual. You're never going to be able to operate from the level of the soul, because the ego is, in a sense, a move inward, at least based on our pure animal instincts and our sensory experience. To form an ego is to form a sense of uniqueness, that you are not your environment, even though you're inextricably and forever related to it, in the sense that you were born out of it and will eventually return to it in death. But you have to acquire that sense of I in relation to an other before you can then learn to love the other, which I think would be the transpersonal mutation or evolution in consciousness, with which Tolle talks a lot about as well. Let's see what else. He says that at the heart of the new consciousness lies the transcendence of thought, the newfound ability of rising above thought, of realizing a dimension within yourself that is infinitely more vast than thought. And as I said, I'm on the same page as Tolle as far as that's concerned. He goes on to say that you then no longer derive your identity, your sense of who you are, from the incessant stream of thinking that in the old consciousness you take to be yourself. So, certainly in spirit, I agree with what Tolle is saying. But we have to ask what he means by thought. Because I think, culturally we're in a dark age at the moment where people don't think critically or rationally in a sense which is important. In other words, we need to attain an understanding of how to reason and make well thought out decisions before we can realize the limits of that particular mode of thought. Because certainly I agree with Tolle that unless we can acknowledge that which transcends thought, we cannot use thought appropriately, because thought itself cannot provide us with the aim or the end. Thought is a technology. It's a practice. It's something we do, and like cause and effect, it ends up altering the objective world. So we can't just stop thinking. We're always going to have to continue to think. Thought for Tolle is merely language or words, but I think that language, Tolle is talking about language in a very simplified way, and sometimes he'll say things like we should return to the pure perception prior to verbal or mental interpretation. And I think when he does that, at least my philosophical mind, my intellect wants to say that, well, maybe language was always already a synthesis of our perception and our interpretation. In other words, language is partially sensory. We speak and we hear, we write and we see, and without this participation of our sensory apparatus, our cognitive or intellectual understanding of the meaning of a word or a sentence or an idea would be empty. Concepts without intuitions are empty, as Kant pointed out. So it's a frustration that I've been experiencing reading Tolle, just because of I guess it's just my philosophic training, my understanding of these concepts that he's using. When I understand, though, at another level, that he's not using these words in a conceptual or philosophical way, but more in a practical way to get people beyond the ego. But see, I don't think necessarily going beyond the ego requires giving up thought. Thought is a skill which we inevitably use as human beings. It's what distinguishes us from nature. The fact that we are aware of nature. We can abstract ourselves out of it and gain a nearly transcendent knowledge of it. Nearly transcendent. Just because a purely transcendent knowledge would imply we would also have complete control over it, I think. We'll never have that because we are necessarily embedded in it So we can only ever control ourselves. There's no getting outside of the cosmos in order to manipulate it to our desire, because our desire was already somehow conditioned by the cosmos, by what was there already. So we can have near objective knowledge of nature, but because there's always that participatory element of the way that our understanding of the world changes our behavior in that world. So as soon as we know something, we act to alter it. There's that, always already present connection between the mind and the world which it experiences. So I guess I'll cut it there to avoid posting a part 2, but I might go on to do that.